Hello. I want to welcome everyone here today. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending upon where you are in the world. We're really happy to have you here. I want to let everyone know that the event is being recorded. And so you'll see a little thing that says got it. You just select got it on your screen. And I also ask that you please mute yourself just so we don't have interference with the presentation. So my name is Emily Loeb, and I'm the Director of Programs and Education here at the Holocaust Center of Pittsburgh. The Holocaust Center connects the horrors of the Holocaust and anti-Semitism with injustices of today. And through education, we seek to address these injustices and then empower individuals to build a more civil and humane society. We work with schools, teachers, and organizations across the region to support them as they teach about the Holocaust and anti-Semitism. And we use a range of tools to do this, including our own comic book series, Chutzpah, which we could talk about later, since that is the theme of the day. We also organize a number of public programs throughout the year, like the one you're attending today, and we've provided a link in the chat to our event page. And we have a slew of events coming up. I don't want to go through all of them, but the one I want to highlight is on Monday, May 6th. We will be hosting our annual Yom HaShoah commemoration at 7 p.m. at Chatham University's Campbell Memorial Chapel. And this will include a candle lighting ceremony to honor the 6 million Jews murdered in the Holocaust, along with honoring veterans, liberators, and the righteous. And our event this year will also include middle and high school students who will be singing songs and reciting poetry. This can be attended both in person or virtually. And so with that, I want to turn to today's program. We are very excited to host both Dr. Rafael Medoff and Mark Zaid. Dr. Medoff is the founding director of the David S. Wyman Institute for Holocaust Studies in Washington, D.C., which focuses on America's response to Nazism and the Holocaust. He's the author of more than 20 books and is a leader in the field of using political cartoons, comic books, and animation as a tool in Holocaust education. He's authored Holocaust-related comic strips for Marvel Comics, the Washington Post, along with Art Spiegelman of Mouse, and the Los Angeles Times and the New Republic. Mark Zaid is a renowned national security attorney based in Washington, D.C. as well. He regularly handles high-profile cases involving federal employees and contractors, including whistleblowers, and often comments on the national media programs. He's the grandson of Rabbi David Eichhorn, the U.S. Army chaplain who led services for the survivors of Dachau in May of 1945. And he also co-edited the book, The GI's Rabbi, concerning his grandfather's experience and correspondence. He is a longstanding comic book collector, dealer, and lectures in the history of comic books. And I should also note he's my cousin, so we have a nice relationship there. So for today's program, Dr. Medoff and Mark will speak for 40 minutes, and then we'll head into questions and answers for about 20 minutes. And if you have questions during the program, please feel free to submit them in the chat, and we'll be consolidating them and then asking them at the end of the program. So again, we are honored to have Dr. Medoff and Mark Zaid here with us today. And with that, I will now mute myself and turn the program over to them.
Thank you, Emily. It's good to be with all of you here today and with my friend and colleague, Mark Zaid, to discuss Whistleblowers, our new nonfiction graphic novel about Americans who spoke up during the Holocaust. I emphasize nonfiction because most graphic novels, as we call them, long-form comic books really, are, of course, works of fiction. But we're working here in an area in which a new medium, comic book illustration, is being used to talk about important historical events. Of course, the Holocaust Center of Pittsburgh has been a pioneer in this area with its innovative Chutzpah series of educational comic books. And we are honored to be following in their footsteps and contributing to the spread of awareness and education about America's response to the Holocaust specifically, but through using this innovative avenue of comic book illustration. In today's program, I want to begin by telling you a little bit about the 4 individuals that our book Whistleblowers focuses on. The subtitle of the book, 4 Who Exposed the Holocaust to America, refers to 4 specific individuals. I want to tell you a little bit about them, and then discuss with you and with Mark Zaid a number of kind of behind the scenes glimpses at what went into creating this book and the different issues that were raised in the production process, in the creative process. So let me begin, first of all, by telling you a little bit about the individuals upon whom this book focuses. One you may have heard of because he was a fairly famous government official. The other 3, fewer people know. The first, the opening chapter of the book Whistleblowers, focuses on Alan Cranston, a name some of you will recognize from American political history because he was a long-term U.S. Senator and in 1984 a candidate for the Democratic presidential nomination. What is not known about Cranston is that when he was a young man, he was a journalist, and he happened to be in Germany in the 1930s covering the emergence of the new Nazi regime. Now, I won't tell you the whole story about what happened there involving Cranston and the Nazis, just a little bit of it because I don't want to spoil the ending. You'll see that when you read the book. But the short of the story, not the long of the story, but the short of the story is that Cranston discovered, because he was fluent in German, Cranston discovered that the English language edition of Mein Kampf, which was being sold in the United States, was not the same as the German language edition that was wildly popular in Germany. Mein Kampf, of course, was Adolf Hitler's infamous manifesto of Nazi ideology, anti-Semitism, racism, violence, expansionism. It was the book that laid out his plans for what he intended to do. But when it was marketed in the United States by an American publisher, Houghton Mifflin, all of the most anti-Semitic and extreme parts of the book were removed. The publisher deliberately sanitized it in order to sell Hitler's program to the American public. Cranston, having seen Mein Kampf in the original German when he was stationed in Germany, stumbled across a copy of this English language version one day in walking down a street in New York City, was horrified to see that Mein Kampf was being whitewashed, and proceeded to publish his own version of the book. He then was sued by Adolf Hitler for copyright violation. We'll tell you more about the case when we discuss it in a few minutes. Our second whistleblower is Josiah Du Bois Jr. He was a Treasury Department official, low-level attorney at the Department of the Treasury in 1943, who quite by accident discovered that the State Department, that his colleagues in the Roosevelt administration in the State Department, were suppressing news about the Holocaust, news that was arriving from Europe, revealing the horrific details of the mass slaughter of the Jews. But the State Department was squashing that news. He also discovered the State Department was obstructing opportunities to rescue Jewish refugees from the Nazis. Du Bois's effort to blow the whistle on this outrage is a story that is told in Whistleblowers. Our third heroic figure is the Secretary of the Treasury, Henry Morgenthau Jr., the only Jewish member of President Roosevelt's cabinet. It was Morgenthau to whom Du Bois turned. Morgenthau was Du Bois's boss. It was Morgenthau to whom he turned when he began to discover what the State Department was doing. And together, Du Bois and Morgenthau collaborated in blowing the whistle on those awful developments. And our final whistleblower is not an American. It was Jan Karski, a Polish Catholic member of the underground resistance in German-occupied Poland. Part of his mission as an underground courier was to serve as an eyewitness to Nazi atrocities against the Jews. The Polish underground smuggled him in to the Warsaw Ghetto and into a Nazi concentration camp so he could see firsthand what was happening to the Jews and then report that news to the Allied leaders. He was smuggled out of Europe and had important meetings in London and Washington, which we'll discuss in more detail shortly. So these are the four remarkable individuals whose stories make up the chronicle, the narrative in our book, Whistleblowers. I'm going to start by telling you a little bit about what went into the process of the cover design of Whistleblowers. And here I'm going to share with you three of the early or preliminary designs of the cover. You'll notice one particular aspect of the early design that didn't make it into the final cover, and that's the American flag. You can see it there in the first version on the left, the roughest version. The flag was originally above the swastika. The artist for Whistleblowers, Dean Motter, a renowned comic book professional, then moved the flag further down in the second version, in the middle version. Dean and I discussed the problem of having the American flag too close to the swastika. While the whole painful story of America's abandonment of the Jews is, of course, at the heart of Whistleblowers, nevertheless, we never want to lose sight of the fact that America was fighting against Nazi Germany. American servicemen and servicewomen were giving their lives in the titanic struggle to defeat Hitler in World War II. So we didn't want it to appear as if the American flag was in close proximity to the swastika. And that's why in the second version, you see it had moved down to next to the text. But in the end, as you see in the nearly final version on the right, we decided that the American flag really didn't belong on the cover at all. And we compensated for that by adding the word America to the subtitle. Notice that in the middle version, we did not say Expose the Holocaust to America. By changing the subtitle, then we felt we also removed any need for having a symbol of America right there on the front cover. The opening chapter of Whistleblowers, as I indicated, deals with the remarkable story of Alan Cranston trying to blow the whistle on the whitewashing of Mein Kampf and the ensuing legal troubles that he encountered. Let's take a quick look at one of the rough layouts for some of the early pages of this chapter. The chapter is called "The Book Hitler Didn't Want You to Read," meaning he didn't want the American public to read the authentic version. So instead, it was the sanitized version. Here I wanted to show you a little bit about the artistic process and sometimes how things change when you go from rough layout to the more tightly penciled version on the right. You see on the left, you can make out Cranston walking along and then the great surprise in his eyes in the middle panel when he's looking at the American version of Mein Kampf. But Dean Motter, the artist, decided that the story had to really be more clearly set in New York City. And so you see in the more finished version on the right, he has placed our story very squarely smack in the middle of Manhattan, where was that Cranston came across this edition of Mein Kampf, and thus setting the whole story in motion. The one more look at the creative process here for this chapter. Here we have the part of the story where the reader actually sees the cover of Cranston's edition of Mein Kampf. It's not in the rough layout at the left, but by the middle version, we had managed to bring the cover in, as you see, and then in the final version of this particular page, fully lettered, fully colored, with all the captions inserted. Now you see the entire cover of the book. Now, that is, in fact, the actual cover of the book, and I can prove it because I actually have a copy of the original Cranston edition of Mein Kampf. As you see, it was a tabloid-sized newspaper, sold for 10 cents. There's a little balloon at the top, a little box boasting that while Hitler's sanitized version was selling for $3 and he was getting all the profits, you could pay 10 cents for this tabloid version, find out the truth about Mein Kampf with not a penny going into Hitler's coffers. The trial that ensued as a result of Hitler and his publisher suing Cranston is a remarkable story in American legal history as well as political Jewish history and the history of America's response to Nazism and the Holocaust. And so this gives me occasion now to turn to my friend and colleague Mark Zaid, the renowned attorney for prominent contemporary whistleblowers. We asked Mark to write the foreword to this book precisely because for Dean and me, the story of whistleblowers is not just an interesting chapter in history, but it is something which has to connect in a moral sense to every generation, to our own time. We're interested in talking about whistleblowers who spoke out against injustice in the 1930s and 40s, in part because of our strong hope that whistleblowers will continue to come forward in our own time to blow the whistle on contemporary injustice. And who better to speak about that and to symbolize the disconnection than Mark Zaid, who has been, who is currently representing some of the most important government officials who have turned whistleblower in recent years. But let me start with a slightly provocative question. Mark, since you're an attorney, if Alan Cranston had turned to you when he was sued by Hitler's publisher, would you have defended him? Did he have a case?
So there are two different answers to that question, Robbie, and it's so nice to be here with everyone, and thanks to the Holocaust Center for having us come in, and hopefully I'll be able to get out to Pittsburgh to do another program at some time soon. So the easy answer is yes, of course, I would have represented him pro bono for free. Absolutely. Did he have a case? You know, looking back on the copyright arguments that they were making, they were innovative, they were novel, they were new. The copyright law had not fully developed. So one of the primary arguments that actually they brought, which probably most people aren't necessarily thinking of, is whether Hitler, as a stateless person, because he was born in Austria, gave up his Austrian citizenship when he was fighting for Germany, whether a stateless person could hold a copyright. That was one of the primary arguments, because the way the law was fashioned, it talked about being a US citizen. Well, that didn't work. And in fact, Cranston's effort wasn't the only one. There were other publishers had been doing something similar in publishing the book for people to see in violation of Hitler's copyright. And they all lost, unfortunately. There was an injunction that was imposed. It was never intended to make money. It was intended to spread the real word about what Mein Kampf actually said. So they had supposedly, by contemporaneous news accounts, and this did make the news, it was in the New York Times, that about 500,000 copies supposedly sold. What I will tell you is I can't find one. I'm so jealous every time Rafi shows that, because I am searching frantically to find a copy of that, and I just cannot find one anywhere. It is very cheap paper, very similar to what some of the early comic books in the mid-1930s were made out of. So I'm not surprised in that standpoint. And about 500,000 copies were apparently destroyed in the wake of the order from the court. And there were supposedly, I've seen different accounts about very low fines imposed on the publisher for this. The other aspect that came by way of a legal argument was did Hitler actually own the copyright versus a publisher in Germany? And basically, the court had ruled, and this went up to the Second Circuit, which is the appellate court in the New York area, Connecticut, etc., that he's the chancellor of Germany by this time. So he clearly knows that he's trying to protect his copyright. And so the court, in very short decisions, unfortunately ruled against. I'll say real quickly, I've been here for 30 years in DC, working on Holocaust issues, lots of legal issues. This was the one story in the book that actually surprised me that I didn't know about it. It's amazing, even with history, how much we don't know. And I'll say finally, the notion of whistleblowers, every story in this book is so important, even more important with what's going on in the world today and rise of anti-Semitism and the lack of even young Jews understanding the significance of what happened back in the past, whether you're Jewish or not. These whistleblowers are more moral whistleblowers. When I'm representing folks, particularly in the national security community, how we take them down a pathway makes a difference to whether they are legally protected as a whistleblower or not. This is very much about ensuring that the public knows. So it's a generic definition of whistleblowers, which is no less important than those who follow the right way, especially when I'm dealing with classified information. But these stories are so important to tell. They were important at the time, and in some ways, maybe one can argue that they're more important or certainly as important to tell now. Rafi, back to you.
Thanks. The second chapter in Whistleblowers is the one part of the book that does not actually involve a whistleblower, but it is directly connected to the subsequent chapters. And this is perhaps the best known story in the history of America's response to the Holocaust. I'm referring to the infamous voyage of the St. Louis, the refugee ship which, carrying 930 German Jews, approached Cuba in 1939 because the passengers had documents they believed would enable them to enter that country, was turned away from Cuba, and then, as we know, sailed north to the coast of Florida, where it waited for a number of days, pleading with President Roosevelt to grant them haven so that they would not have to return to Nazi Germany. The story of the St. Louis is in chapter 2 of Whistleblowers is called Voyage of the Doomed. As you can see from these this preliminary see the process of the development of what we call the splash page, the opening page to the chapter, which we initially considered doing strictly in black and white to give it more of a period feel. Although once the colorists became involved, we saw that her work, the work of Julie Barclay, added a dimension of power and drama through the use of a flame-like image in the background to symbolize the tragedy of what happened to the St. Louis. The reason the St. Louis came into this story at all is because a couple of years ago, my colleagues and I were approached by the family of one of the surviving passengers on the ship, a man named Arthur Weil, who it turned out had kept a diary aboard the ship. This is only the second known surviving diary of a St. Louis passenger. Here I'm showing you an actual page from the diary. He took notes while he was aboard the ship and then typed them up later. As you can see, of course, they were in German. He was one of the fortunate ones who survived. His diary survived. And the family approached us because they wanted the diary to come to public attention, but in a way that would especially engage young people, so that high school and college students today would hear about the story of the St. Louis through the eyes of an actual passenger. We suggested the idea of telling his story through comic book illustration. This, of course, is a unique way to talk about history. It's not the way that normally historians would present such a rare document, but in order to reach a much wider audience, hopefully to reach school age audiences and the university world, we decided to tell the story for the first time in Whistleblowers because of a remarkable connection between the story of the St. Louis and our later chapters. I want to show you one page from the actual story, The Voyage of the Doomed, because it illustrates a technique we use here. Throughout the story, almost all of the narration consists of actual excerpts from Arthur Weil's diary. Aside from that yellow box at the top, which is my introductory explanation, the rest of the story is told directly through the words of Arthur Weil. So it's not just some historian talking about what happened to the St. Louis. Here is a man who, together with his wife and child, were aboard the ship, went through the hope and the agony of that voyage. And so the reader learns the story in this very unique way, completely different from any other way in which the story of the St. Louis has been told. The details of the voyage of the St. Louis are, I suppose, rather well known. So I won't retell the story here, given our time limits, except to say that, of course, the ship was forced to return to Europe, where a number of countries gave temporary refuge to the passengers. But then those countries, with one exception, were overrun by the Nazis just a year later, and many of the passengers were then murdered in the Holocaust. But interestingly enough, Secretary of the Treasury Henry Morgenthau tried behind the scenes to convince President Roosevelt to grant haven to the passengers. His failure, Morgenthau's failure to persuade the president at that time, ultimately helped galvanize him later in chapter 3, as you'll see in Whistleblowers, when we tell the story of that young attorney, Josiah Du Bois, and his efforts to blow the whistle on the State Department's obstruction of Holocaust rescue and Holocaust news. Du Bois is a remarkable character because he's so unknown at the time and subsequently. There are not even many photographs of him. Here's one, though, with his staff from 1943. Du Bois is seated. He's in the middle. He's looking down papers, and you see his hand extended to the documents that he and the other three men are looking at. After the war, despite his remarkable accomplishments in blowing the whistle on the State Department and forcing President Roosevelt, in effect, forcing him very late in the war to help rescue a small number of Jews, despite that astounding accomplishment, Du Bois never made any effort in the years after the Holocaust to tell his story. And so he is one of the least known heroes of the Holocaust. And I think we can use that word, the word hero, in cases like this, because for me, a hero means someone who risks themselves, risks their personal status, welfare, or well-being in order to try to help someone else. And in this case, Du Bois risked his entire career by going up against the State Department and combining and working with Morgenthau in order to try to save Jews from the Nazi genocide. One more page from the Du Bois chapter. That chapter is called Blowing the Whistle on Genocide, appropriately. One more page, because I want to share with you another interesting insight about the creative process. So there is a well-known technique in the world of comic book creation known as the silent story. There are a number of famous issues of well-known comic books where the entire story is told without any words. And here I'm showing you a page from an issue of Batman in which the entire story contains no word balloons, no thought balloons, no narration of any sort, and yet the reader is able to follow the story very closely and clearly through the remarkable artwork. I had that in mind because in addition to my work as a historian, I have a background as a young comic book fan. I remembered this phenomenon of the silent Batman. And so as I was working on the text for Whistleblowers, I looked for an opportunity to perhaps include a silent page. And as you'll see, I found this in the story of Josiah Du Bois blowing the whistle on genocide. When I tried to imagine what it must have been like for Du Bois sitting at a desk in Washington, seeing all these reports about the mass murder of the Jews, feeling so helpless, seeing his own colleagues in the State Department suppressing the news, seeing his own president, Franklin Roosevelt, turning a blind eye to this tragedy. And so Dean Motter and I created this page where we use a kind of a checkerboard style to intersperse images of one little girl about to be deported and then murdered by the Nazis, and interspersing that with images of Du Bois in Washington. I think it's one of the most compelling pages in Whistleblowers. Let me now turn to one final image from this chapter, Blowing the Whistle on Genocide, because it involves an iconic American symbol. I think what Dean accomplished here on this particular page is especially striking. You'll see in the rough version of this page, down at the bottom, you see in a side view of President Roosevelt. You can see sitting in his wheelchair. The public rarely saw the wheelchair, but of course today it's well known. But you see in the finished page on the right, there is an image that did not appear in the original rough layout, and that's the Statue of Liberty, surrounded by gates with chains. The image of Roosevelt at his desk is still there, the image from the Oval Office, but now it's in the lower right-hand corner. But this illustration of the Statue of Liberty, to me, was especially moving because those chains symbolize the sad tragedy of an America which had once opened its doors to so many refugees, so many downtrodden, oppressed people from around the world. Yet during the Holocaust, the doors of America were largely chained shut, as only a handful of Jews from Europe were permitted by the Roosevelt administration to enter our country. And now just a few words about our final chapter, the fourth chapter of Whistleblowers, before we turn to questions from the audience. So as I mentioned earlier, our fourth chapter is the one that focuses on a non-American, Jan Karski, a brave Polish underground courier who was smuggled into the Warsaw Ghetto, into a Nazi concentration camp, so he could see firsthand what was happening to the Jews. The Karski story it includes a number of interesting artistic elements, and I want to share one of those with you now. This is a familiar problem for comic book artists: how to portray events that take place at night. And here, as you can see on the right-hand side, I think Dean very effectively discovered a way of doing that by using a dark color, kind of a bluish gray, and drawing a number of characters in a kind of silhouette. So you see that it's nighttime, but it's not so dark. He doesn't use black so much to the point where you can't see what's going on. These two pages also bring in an element that Dean and I grappled with during the creative process, and that was how to show the Holocaust in a way that was authentic, but not so brutal that readers would be turned off. They would find it difficult to continue the story. This is a problem for all Holocaust historians, but especially for those of us working in a medium where it's visual. We want to make it clear that this was mass murder, but we want to do it in a way that is, for lack of a better word, tasteful, or not so ghastly that it will be off-putting. You see down in the lower panels of both of these pages, there are scenes of mass executions, but you don't actually see bodies falling, you don't see blood, yet I think nonetheless Dean was able to effectively convey the essence of what was happening there. One last image from this fourth and final chapter, Whistleblowers. This chapter is called Karski's Mission. Now, in this page, what we see is an episode to which I've alluded when Karski was smuggled into the Warsaw Ghetto. He was taken to the top floor of a building because his guides wanted him to witness something that was happening every day in the ghetto, but which nobody in the outside world could have known. And that was what was called the Jew Hunt, in which members of the Hitler Youth would come into the Warsaw Ghetto and would just shoot Jews at random for target practice, for fun, as they considered it. Here too, we had the question of how to show this horror without it being too horrible, so to speak. So in the second panel, as you can see, Dean has drawn two members of the Hitler Youth with guns that are smoking. You see the smoke rising from the guns, although you don't see their actual victims. But I think that image, although somewhat subtle, nonetheless conveys the essence of the terrible truth that we try to convey in this book, in which Jan Karski tried to reveal to Allied leaders. Sadly, when Karski shared this information with President Roosevelt, he was very disappointed to find that the president was uninterested. There's much more to say, of course, on this vast and difficult topic, but Mark and I, at this point, I think would be very pleased to take your questions, and we'll talk more about our own personal connection to the material, about the history of America's response to the Holocaust, and of course about the use of comic book illustration, the graphic novel medium, to talk about these subjects.
Yeah, and as we wait for some of the questions to come in, let me give a minute or two about comics and the Holocaust, as this is a very important topic, and it's one that some of you may be familiar with, because the reality is so much of our comic book history in the United States was created by Jews. We were the sort of predominant artists and writers in the 30s through the 60s. Most of the major characters that we know today, and many who did not survive over time, like Superman and Batman and Captain America, and most of the folks in the Avengers that you go see in movies were all created by Jewish authors, writers, artists, colorists, very prominent. For a variety of reasons. One, they generally could not work in other fields at the time. Advertising, mainstream, the notion of anti-Semitism blocking certain religious personas from engaging in that industry. And also just, families hiring family members. Stan Lee's uncle was Martin Goodman at Timely, the predecessor to Marvel. So there's a little bit of nepotism there as well, though obviously very talented person, Stan Lee, as we all know, because he's in every Marvel movie and created most of the characters. But the subject of the Holocaust and what was going on to Jews in World War II, though not widely known for the most part in the United States, was not often touched upon in the comics, particularly because while what we've done with this and what are written in comics today for adults, not so for when we were all kids. They were written for kids. Comics until really the late 80s were written for 7 to 15-year-olds. So there's a lot of very, hefty subject matter that's just not going to be in a comic book back at that time. And even the notion of covering World War II was an issue, because here Europe is in World War II 2 years before us. What does Superman do? Does Superman fight the Nazis when we are neutral against Germany in 1939 and 1940? So when you look at comic books in DC, for DC, Superman is fighting tanks and planes. They're probably German, but there's no Nazi insignias on them whatsoever, versus Marvel comics actually would have the Submariner fighting Nazi U-boats. But while there were some concentration camps depicted in comics, there was no indication that the individuals in them were Jews. Obviously, Dachau, where my grandfather helped liberate in April of 1945, was created in 1933. So it had been around for a good decade or so, and that was known that people were imprisoned there, political prisoners, those who were against the Reich, etc., and obviously those who just didn't fit into the stereotype that that Reich had. But it really wasn't until the mid-50s that you started to see a little bit of conversation in comic books about acknowledging the Holocaust, and even more into the 60s and into modern time. For those who are fans of the X-Men, Magneto, we learn, was a Holocaust survivor as a child. though his character was created in about 1963, give or take a few months, with no indication of that. That was a later development of a story. So this has been a very difficult topic for the comic book industry to handle in the beginning. I'll finish by saying I once asked Joe Simon, who co-created Captain America with Jack Kirby, both Jewish, in 1941, showed up in March of 41. Why on the cover of this issue do you have Captain America punching Adolf Hitler in the face? Was it because you as a Jew wanted to strike back against the Nazis? And the response was, no, we thought it would sell comic books.
So
Rocky, oh, go ahead, Emily. You're going to do that?
So yeah, that's actually a great segue into one of our first questions, which is, Rafi, what is the appropriate age for your graphic novel?
Whistleblowers is not a book for children. It was written for adults, but of course I had in mind that it's particularly important that that young adults, teenagers, read it as well. So I think it can be read by not only by adults but by university students, by high school students, and even by middle school students where appropriate. Of course, that's always a decision for parents to make. As I noted earlier, Dean and I were careful to avoid using imagery that would be so disturbing that that a teenager, for example, might find too unsettling. We don't sugarcoat it, but we try to approach the most horrific aspects of the story in a nuanced way that will make it appropriate even for middle school age children.
Dr. Barbara Burston, who's also a historian that specializes in the American response to the Holocaust, asks this question: why did you choose Josiah Du Bois and not John Paley for the subject?
Well, a bit of background for those who are not familiar with this. So Du Bois, John Paley, and several other staff attorneys at the Treasury Department were all involved, broadly speaking, in the events leading to the exposure of the State Department's obstruction and the confrontation between Secretary Morgenthau and President Roosevelt over the failure to rescue Jews. So the focus on Josiah Du Bois was not meant in any way to slight John Paley or the other staff members, all of whom, by the way, appear in the story. But Du Bois is a particularly important or particularly compelling figure in this drama because it was Du Bois who was the primary author of an extraordinary report which served as the basis for Secretary Morgenthau confronting President Roosevelt. And to tell it briefly, when Du Bois first began to discover the State Department's obstruction, it was Du Bois who first encountered it, Morgenthau asked Du Bois to compile a detailed report, putting down on paper everything that Du Bois was learning about what the State Department was doing. That report, which was originally titled Report to the Secretary on the Acquiescence of this Government in the Murder of the Jews. Think about the power of that title. The Acquiescence of this Government in the Murder of the Jews. That was the title of Du Bois's report to Morgenthau. And that report was what made it possible for Secretary Morgenthau to confront President Roosevelt and force the president in an election year to undertake one late gesture to help Jewish refugees. So Du Bois is the focus on this story, but as you'll see when you read Whistleblowers, the entire staff, including his colleague John Paley, are appropriately credited as well.
And Silu has two questions, which I'll just lay out, and then if you need a reminder, feel free to ask for a refresh of the question. One was, how old was Arthur Weil when he wrote the diary? And also, what particular challenges did these four whistleblowers face? What kept them from going in their continuing efforts what kept them going in their continuing efforts for people to not only take notice, but also take action? So again, the first one was, how old was Arthur Weil?
Arthur Weil was in his early 30s when this took place. He was among the thousands of Jews who were rounded up and taken to concentration camps during the Kristallnacht pogrom in November 1938. And he and his brother were released from detention on condition that they leave the country. And it was then that they secured what they thought were admission papers to Cuba, and when they booked passage on the St. Louis. So Weil, his wife, and their young daughter were the passengers on the St. Louis. Now, the second question, as I understand it, is what did these individual whistleblowers, what kind of consequences did they face in making their decisions? Well, the answer is different in each case. As we've seen, Alan Cranston faced legal consequences. He had no way of knowing how the judge might rule, and when he set about creating his truthful edition of Mein Kampf, he may or may not have realized what kind of trouble he might get in, but he soon found out. The experience of Josiah Du Bois, of course, was very different. Here he was, a government bureaucrat who was digging around to find out what his colleagues in the State Department were doing. As you'll see in the story, Du Bois received threats that could have been to his career, maybe even to his life. We don't know, but he did receive threatening phone calls. So he understood once he got deep into the process of preparing to blow the whistle on his government colleagues, he understood that there was a real danger to him professionally and personally, and yet courageously he pursued that. With Morgenthau, it was a little bit different. Morgenthau cherished his relationship with President Roosevelt. He considered himself a personal friend of the president. He was to a certain extent. During his years in the Treasury, Morgenthau almost never brought up Jewish problems or Jewish questions to the president. I mentioned earlier that when the St. Louis was hovering off the coast of Florida and the refugees were begging to be admitted to the United States, Morgenthau privately tried to bring about a decision by the president to save them. But he didn't go to the president directly. He went to Secretary of State Cordell Hull, who then went to the president with Morgenthau's idea of letting the St. Louis passengers settle temporarily in the U.S. Virgin Islands. FDR turned down that idea. But even then, even at that juncture, Morgenthau was still rather timid about the idea of directly going to the president about a Jewish concern. He felt it wasn't his place. He didn't want to be seen as a Jewish member of the cabinet, but as a cabinet member who happened to be Jewish. But in 1943, when Du Bois and his colleagues brought to Morgenthau's attention the horrific details of the mass murder and of the State Department's suppression of it, that's when Morgenthau was moved to risk what he thought was a risk to his friendly relationship with the president by confronting FDR in the Oval Office about an issue that Morgenthau himself had not raised with the president until then. Jan Karski was literally risked his life. Karski had previously been captured by the Nazis, had been tortured. He had been, his colleagues had rescued him from a hospital, a Nazi hospital, where he was a patient after having undergone severe torture. He was smuggled out of Europe in order to meet with British government officials and with President Roosevelt. And each stage of this process, Karski risked his life, especially when he was smuggled into a Nazi concentration camp disguised as a Ukrainian guard. Had he been discovered, we may assume, and surely he expected, that he would have been executed. So each of these four individuals faced very different kinds of tests, but what links them all together, I would argue, was an essential moral fortitude, a measure of courage, which unfortunately many people in those circumstances would not have been able to muster.
Yeah,
Thank
I
you.
interestingly found out Karski is buried here in Washington, D.C.
Yes, after the war,
Allison,
Karski
sorry, go ahead.
remained.
Sorry.
So I was going to say Karski remained in the U.S. After his disappointing meeting with President Roosevelt in 1943. The underground felt it was too difficult to try to bring him back to Europe, so he stayed in the U.S. He undertook various information campaigns to support the occupied Poland and the Polish resistance, and then he remained in America after the war. He ultimately became a professor of political science at Georgetown University. Again, like the others, made almost no effort to publicize his extraordinary courage during the Holocaust years. And even Karski's story was only very belatedly brought to public attention. And yes, and he ultimately he lived the remainder of his life in the United States and is buried in Washington, D.C.
That's actually a perfect segue to this next question from Allison in talking about who you learned about, who were the whistleblowers during the Holocaust. Are there any women you identified as whistleblowers in your work to put this graphic novel together? And if so, who are they, and are they visible in the novel?
In the story of Josiah Du Bois and Secretary Morgenthau, as I mentioned, the other staff members of the Treasury Department who were involved in that whole episode are also brought into the story and credited. And among these additional individuals was Secretary Morgenthau's right-hand woman, Henrietta Klotz. Henrietta Klotz officially was Morgenthau's secretary, and yet she was sitting in on all the meetings between Morgenthau, Du Bois, Pele, and the others, and was often part of their discussions, would offer her opinion, was invited to offer her insights, and she was a part of the process too. So Henrietta Klotz does come into the story in that way, and she is credited, and hopefully historians will do more research on her role in the future.
Yeah, I'll add, sorry,
Mark.
Emily, the one part of the story in the Cranston story that I find almost humorous, and it was involving a woman. I'm not sure if I would say from a whistleblower standpoint, but when Cranston was feverishly working to translate Mein Kampf to be published in the format that was shown in this newspaper, he had at least one woman, I'm sure there were multiple people helping him out to produce this newspaper. And they didn't know what he was doing, or they didn't know why he was doing it. So they reported him to the Anti-Defamation League to say that he was promoting Nazi beliefs and trying to put out Mein Kampf. And the ADL visited Cranston to ask, what the hell are you doing with all this? And then he revealed to them, no, I'm doing this to expose what Hitler is all about. And then they ended up working together to help publish the book, or to publish the newspaper. This is kind of interesting story of, nobody knew why he was doing it. He was doing it for the right reasons, but they thought he was trying to help Hitler at first.
I thought this would be a great moment to make sure we're going to put links in the chat to both a link to an Amazon account where you could buy Whistleblowers for who fought to expose the Holocaust to America. So if you want to purchase the book, you can do that there. And in the question that Allison had about women, one of our Chutzpah volumes, volume 4, focuses specifically on women in the Holocaust and actually features Audrey Hepburn, who helped a lot of people in Austria. So she was a righteous Gentile who helped Jews in Austria. So we have another question, which is directed to Mark. Can you help us understand the magnitude of the risk that whistleblowers take from your experience representing them?
Sure. It's a great question. And it's a difficult one because obviously everyone is going to face potentially difficult or different consequences. Now, I have to separate, and without going into a lot of details, because obviously this could be its own presentation, the notion of, since we're talking about sort of moral whistleblowers with this book rather than legal whistleblowers, someone like Ed Snowden, who released classified information, without getting into right or wrong as far as a moral standpoint of revealing U.S. domestic surveillance, it was illegal. So there were consequences. That's why he's been indicted. That's why he's still in Russia. Versus individuals who might be fired or face risk of disciplinary action, or as Rafi said, threatening phone calls, things like that. When I was representing the intelligence community whistleblower during the first Trump impeachment proceedings, the identity of that whistleblower was unknown, still largely remains unknown, but I would receive death threats as the lawyer. So there are a lot of consequences, unfortunately, that come with being a whistleblower. In the world, whistleblowers very often aren't looked upon that favorably. In the United States, on paper, we very much support whistleblowers. The practice is a little bit different, unfortunately. But obviously, there is a very, very important role for it. In fact, it led me to create an organization called Whistleblower Aid back 7 years ago already, where we provide free legal representation to whistleblowers. So in addition to the IC whistleblower, the intelligence community whistleblower, we represented the Facebook whistleblower, the Twitter whistleblower, some really high profile cases where these folks couldn't otherwise afford to pay for legal representation. I mean, the reality is we're too darn expensive.
Dr. Medoff, I was wondering if you could speak briefly about, in the moments that we have remaining, about why is how the U.S. responded to the Holocaust important? Why is this important to study and to understand?
It's important because, unfortunately, the Holocaust was not the last genocide. Every generation of Americans faces similar moral dilemmas. Should we respond? Is it our obligation to use America's power to interrupt mass persecution that takes place in other countries? And we've seen multiple instances of genocide or ethnic cleansing in recent decades, from the genocide in Cambodia, in Rwanda, the ethnic cleansing in the Balkans, genocide in Darfur, Sudan. Again and again, American presidents have been confronted with the question of how to respond. Sadly, much of the response has been weak. And although books like Whistleblowers are intended to inspire a more robust and active response to human rights violations around the world, sadly, we've seen again and again that for various political and other reasons, our leaders have not responded. An important exception was the ethnic cleansing in the Balkans in the 1990s, to which President Clinton belatedly used American power to intervene and to stop mass murder there. I should also mention, of course, President Obama's use of American air power to rescue Yazidis who were thousands of Yazidi civilians who were trapped and facing mass death at the hands of ISIS some years ago. But unfortunately, the responses to other genocides by our country has been weak. My hope in writing Whistleblowers and the other work I do, shedding light on America's response to the Holocaust, is that future generations of Americans will learn from the mistakes of those years and push for a more active and meaningful response when innocent people are being persecuted around the world.
Well, thank you so much. I know it's 12:59, but we just had a really great question come in, which is, so I'm going to just add it in here. Do you see a link between whistleblowing and the bystander effect? It's a great question.
So bystander effect, meaning no one
Staying
doing anything?
silent.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, of course. Humans are humans, and they're very much influenced by everyone around them, and it is difficult for people to speak out. I will say, having represented whistleblowers for now 3 decades, they often are a very specific type of personality, for better or for worse. Sometimes, most of the time, they're their own worst enemy, quite frankly. You can cross a line where you push too to further. Kitty Genovese, of course, when she was murdered in New York City, nobody did anything about it. And of course, we know the whole poem, the famous poem about, nobody said anything that came for the communists. Nobody said anything that came for the Jews. Nobody said anything that came for me because there was no one left to say anything. Some whistleblowers inadvertently fall within it. I doubt if we had asked Alan Cranston, if were he still alive, did he see himself as a whistleblower? He probably would have had a different concept of what it meant, even though you can fit it within that definition, as Rafi was talking about. So the instinct of most people, quite frankly, I mean, just think about it, put yourself in your own shoes. I'm sure most of us have been in some situation where we're on a subway, on a bus, down a street, and someone is being hassled, and the tendency is you walk kind of right by. And that might be the smart thing to do, quite frankly, depending on the circumstances. But it's also a difficult question for those of us as Jews, of if you put it in the historical context. So, yeah, it's a great question. And it's obviously, I'm sure there's a lot of information about that out there.
Well, thank you both so much for joining us today. Again, for everyone who has joined us, please look in the chat. There's a link to purchase Whistleblowers. There's a link for information about our Yom HaShoah event coming up on May 6th, and then also a link to Chutzpah. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us at the Holocaust Center. And Mark Zaid and Rafael Medoff, thank you so much. This was really wonderful.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Our pleasure.